One of the fun things of being a historian is the bulk of my job is giving tours of the Gettysburg battlefield. As far as my count, I've given in my career so far over 2,500 tours of the battlefield. I've not tried to figure out how many hours that comes out to. I really don't want to know. But one of the things that I find interesting, and really one of the historic figures that I admire the most in all of history, is the individual you see here, Winston Churchill. So when we think of Churchill, we really associate him with the Second World War. But really, by the time of the Second World War, Churchill has already lived a long and very exciting life up to that point. And what we will see is that throughout his life, he had, from childhood, a fascination with the American Civil War. We'll kind of delve into why that is. So I want to start out and kind of set the stage. How many of you are local here? How many of you remember the weather Thursday? Yeah. Okay, kind of a rainy, misty, foggy, nasty day. Well, I want you to take that day and I want you to rewind this tape 91 years ago yesterday. Because what we will see on that day is two visitors from Great Britain are given a tour of the Gettysburg battlefield by a licensed battlefield guide. One is Sir Ronald Lindsay, the ambassador to the United States from Great Britain, and the other, Winston Churchill. But the Churchill of February of 1932 is a far cry from the Churchill that we think of today, the great statesman and wartime leader of Great Britain, and in my opinion, the single most important figure of the Second World War. Churchill in this time was in the midst of what he calls his wilderness period, which is very interesting because whenever you have a politician fall from grace and they kind of have their comeback, what do they usually call that period? Their wilderness period. So even in American politics, Churchill has an influence. But while he is out of power, this wilderness period gives him time to think, gives him time to research. It also gives him time to lecture on topics such as the global tensions rising in Europe and Asia. He will write about the economic impact of the Great Depression, and also on historical topics that were of a particular interest to him. One of those topics was the American Civil War. Churchill will make two visits to Gettysburg in his life. One in 1932 that we're going to really detail heavily, and then again in 1959. And in many ways, his visits to Gettysburg sort of parallel the trajectory of his life. And I think it's very interesting when you take a look at great historic figures to sometimes look at them in just small sections. And really what we're going to be looking at in Churchill's life is really about a 3-year period from 1929 to 1932. So ultimately, what brings Churchill here in 1932? Well, the answer to that question begins 57 years before. What you are looking at is the birthplace of Winston Churchill. Not too shabby digs, right? This is Blenheim Palace, and it will be at this location on November 30th, 1874, that Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill will be born. Now, he will be born into a very famous family. The Churchill-Spencer line is really one of the most famous of British aristocratic families. The Churchill line dates back to the individual that you see here. Let me see if I can make this thing work. Let's see, there we go. Right there, that is John Churchill, later known as the first Duke of Marlborough. Now, the nice palace that you see here was given to him as a gift by Queen Anne. It was built between 1705 and 1722. It is named after the 1704 Battle of Blenheim, which was really the decisive battle of the War of Spanish Succession. Bet you weren't expecting to hear that one today, right? But we play all the hits here. Now, when Churchill is born into this home, he is literally being born into a war memorial. Blenheim is really this vast building that honors the contributions of John Churchill, one of Britain's greatest soldiers in terms of a military commander. In many ways, in British military history, there is only one rival to John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, and that's the Duke of Wellington. So what we will see is that Churchill did not grow up in Blenheim, but he spent a lot of time there. And certainly this experience helped kind of shape the person that he will be. Churchill will later say at Blenheim, "I made two very important decisions, to be born and to marry. I am content with the decision I made on both occasions." Leave it to Winston Churchill to make the decision to be born. Now, of course, Churchill's father, Randolph Churchill, was a direct descendant of John Churchill. I should note the family that he is born into, the Spencer family, probably the most famous Spencer that you would know of, Princess Diana. So to give you to tie that back. Beyond that, that's all I know about royal genealogy. It's way too in-depth for my abilities. So here is a photo of Lord Randolph Churchill and his wife Jenny Jerome. And you'll see the photo of them here. This is taken around 1874, the time of their marriage and the year of Churchill's birth. You also see the nice little dog they have there. You'll also see young Winston at the age of 6 there. So if you ever wanted to know what a cute, precocious Winston Churchill looked like, there he is. And Churchill will have a very difficult relationship with his parents, to say the least. Both were sort of absent parents. In many ways, Churchill was raised by others, always kind of yearning for his parents' love. But they are going to have an influence on him nonetheless. Now, as I mentioned before, Winston's parents were both from very aristocratic backgrounds. One, his father Randolph, was a British aristocrat, but his mother was not. Jenny Jerome is born in Brooklyn, New York. Now, both his parents would have grown up during the 1860s. In the case of his father remembered following the news of this great conflict going on in North America. We think about the British people were very much divided on their opinion of that war. And of course, one of the great hopes of the Confederacy was that one day England might come in on their side. And one of the things that Churchill will often get critiqued for, and sometimes used against him politically, is his American background. One individual once said that Winston Churchill has too many American qualities. Another individual referred to him as a half-breed American.
His mother had the money, though.
Well, we'll get to that in a minute. Don't steal my thunder. I mean, if you want the mic, here you go. So one person will say that he was half British aristocrat and half American gambler. Now, when his mother was 9 years old, it's July of 1863, growing up in New York City. Is that a good place to be in July of 1863? No. She is witnessing the draft riots. She will also remember in 1865, looking down from their home on East 26th Street, the horse-drawn coffin carrying the assassinated president, Abraham Lincoln. So the Civil War, even though did not impact his parents directly, certainly they came of age during this very trying time. We will see an image here of Leonard Jerome. This is Jenny's father and, of course, Winston's maternal grandfather. The painting that you see here actually hangs in Blenheim Palace today. Now, Leonard Jerome was a flamboyant, successful stock speculator. Notice I didn't say trader, speculator. So he's at one time known as the King of Wall Street. He also, at times, would make a fortune. He would also very quickly lose a fortune. He had a passion for a number of things. He was always interested in the arts. He helped found the Academy of Music, one of New York's earliest opera houses. He also had a passion for thoroughbred racing and will eventually help found the American Jockey Club. Winston certainly would be a longtime fan of the theater, and also in his younger days was a really talented polo player. So certainly maybe he gets some of this from Leonard Jerome. Now, Jerome was noted in 1861 for his active support of the Union, and more specifically Abraham Lincoln. In fact, he actually paid out of pocket what was listed as a considerable sum to build the warship Meteor. You might have money, but do you can build a federal warship money? That's Jerome. Now, in 1858, he will buy a substantial stake in the New York Times. Now, sometimes he is listed erroneously as owning the New York Times during the Civil War. He owns about a fifth of the New York Times, but a significant chunk of it. Fast forward to the draft riots in July of 1863, just a few days after the Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. And what you will see is the draft riots, really, let's call them what they truly were. They're a race riot. It is an ugly time in parts of Manhattan. People will be targeted simply by the color of their skin or their political affiliation. In the case of Jerome, his newspaper that he owns a significant stake in becomes a target because of the New York Times' support of the Union war effort and Lincoln. As a mob is moving towards the Times building, greeting them out front is Leonard Jerome, and he's packing a Gatling gun. So clearly the rioters really only got about as close as seeing the Gatling gun and said, you know what, we're not that brave. So if you've ever seen, there's a famous photo of Churchill carrying a Thompson machine gun. He's got his bowler hat on. He just looks really Churchillian, because he is. But what we will see is often think about that to this famous account of his grandfather defending the New York Times with a Gatling gun, and think back to that famous photo of Churchill with the Thompson machine gun. So you can see that Churchill comes from a very unique family. We will see here a picture of Winston Churchill. This is in 1895, just after he has graduated from the Military Academy of Sandhurst. In his first year as being a soldier, you will also see him in 1916 on the Western Front of Europe in the trenches. So we often think of Churchill, the statesman, the political leader, but at his core, he was always a soldier. And from a very early age, Churchill gravitated to all things military. Churchill will later date his interest in the Civil War back to 1882 at the age of 7, when going through old back issues of the political satire magazine Punch, he is going to see Civil War cartoons that were made during the war. He's captivated by these. This only continues to grow. Before his 13th birthday, he will write to his mother about his preferred present. He will write, "I would rather General Grant's History of the American War. Illustrated, please." The combination of his family's martial heritage, the glowing accounts of British military forces at really what was the height of the British Empire, and of course his interest in military history drew Churchill into wanting to become a soldier. Winston once remarked that the Civil War was the most interesting of all the wars I read. And he read a lot of wars in his lifetime. Churchill's study of the Civil War, though, would prove very beneficial. In 1890, a portion of his entrance exam to the Military Academy at Sandhurst was an essay on the American Civil War. While at Sandhurst, he became associated with one of the leading experts in England on the American Civil War, G.F. Henderson. If you look at some Civil War books, you will still see him in the notes today. In 1895, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the British Army. The same year, he had a very favorable opinion of a novel that he just read. It was written by Stephen Crane. It's called The Red Badge of Courage. Now, while Churchill did not serve a long career in the military, he kind of used the military as a means to an end. He often used his military service as a way to go do what was really one of his big passions, which was writing and journalism. He would often use his military background as a means to get into places where otherwise he would not go. But he always looked back on himself as a soldier. Now, in 1895, Churchill is going to make his first visit to the United States. And when he is in New York City, through family connections, he is going to be introduced to the individual that you see here. This is Congressman William Bork Cochran. Cochran was a friend of the Churchill family. He was also reputed to be a one-time lover of Churchill's mother. That could have been awkward. So what Cochran does, he introduces Churchill to really New York high society. Churchill, years later, credited Cochran as his first political mentor. and in his words, the chief role model for his own success as an orator. What is Churchill most known for, folks? It's his speeches. This is who he learned from. Now, Churchill will describe in the 1930s Cochrane as a pacifist, individualist, Democrat, capitalist, and a gold bug. He was equally opposed to socialists, inflationists, and protectionists, and he resisted them all at every occasion. Now, Churchill clearly never became a pacifist, but he did adopt many of Cochrane's stances throughout his career politically. And he carefully read and reread speeches that Cochrane gave. In fact, in 1946, when Churchill delivers his Iron Curtain speech, he is going to note, recalling words which I learned 50 years ago from a great Irish-American orator, a friend of mine, Mr. Bork Cochrane. There is enough for all. The earth is a generous mother. She will provide in plentiful abundance food for all of her children, but if they will cultivate her soil in justice and peace. Cochrane was a well-known Tammany Hall Democrat, which means that he is a contemporary of this man right here. Now, in fact, between 1891 and 1893, Cochrane represented New York's 10th Congressional District in Washington. As often happens, congressional districts get redesignated, redrawn, and eventually Cochrane is going to be redistricted into what becomes the 12th New York Congressional District, following as the next congressman representing the 10th Congressional District, none other than Daniel Sickles. And it will be in this term that follows when Sickles will play a critical role in creating the Gettysburg National Military Park. Now, I have no evidence that there was ever a time when Sickles and Churchill are in the same room together. But it's not beyond the realm of possibility. But we have no mentions of Churchill saying he met Sickles. Certainly if Churchill had known Sickles in the same room. Can you imagine those two having a conversation? So we'll say a major influence who has very direct Civil War connections. So let's kind of fast forward things to Winston Churchill in 1929. Now, if you look at him here, Churchill being very well dressed, he's standing on the steps of the White House. This photo was taken in October of 1929. He had just finished a meeting with Herbert Hoover, the President of the United States, where they were discussing the economic issues. After meeting with the President, Churchill quickly left and began to take that information he got from Herbert Hoover and use it to speculate on the economic situation, trying to make a buck. Pro tip for your life, never take economic advice from Herbert Hoover. A week later, the stock market crashes. So when Churchill comes over in 1929, he's beginning his period in the wilderness. The Conservative Party in Great Britain is out of power, which means that Churchill, as his role of Chancellor of the Exchequer, basically the Secretary of Treasury in England, is gone. So now we have Churchill, really who always lived beyond his means financially, losing his job. With the job, he also loses his house. So Churchill realizes, I need money, and I need it quick. So how do you do that? You get your American friends to put together a coast-to-coast speaking tour for you. In fact, Churchill will spend time in Hollywood. This is actually Churchill talking with Charlie Chaplin, to kind of give you a sense of who he's meeting. So Churchill also realizes it's the perfect time to do that because I have nothing but free time and I need the money. So obviously the money from the speeches was the main reason Churchill came over, but he also wanted to build a better relationship with the United States and to do research on, at this moment, was just the very genesis of a history of the British Empire that he was going to write. Eventually in the 1950s, it will become his 4-volume History of English-Speaking Peoples, maybe his most famous written work ever. Part of his journey through the United States will eventually bring him to the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, when he visits Virginia in October of 1829, it coincides with the anniversary of the 1781 Battle and Siege of Yorktown. Now, Churchill was actually invited to Yorktown to attend the ceremonies. Churchill, though, declined the event, in his words, due to patriotic reasons over the outcome. Now, his national pride, though, did not stop him from touring other battlefields, especially the Civil War battlefields around Richmond and Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania County in Virginia. Now, the timeline is somewhat murky on when Churchill really set about deciding to write his 4-volume history, but it's very clear that in 1929, there's at least something percolating in his mind about this. And one of the reasons why he wants to go to Virginia, and actually one of the longer stays he will have in his 1929 trip, is to tour these Civil War battlefields. So we will see pictured here the individual who Churchill stayed with. This is Governor Henry Byrd of Virginia, maybe one of the most influential governors of Virginia in the 20th century. His son, Henry Jr., will also become the longest tenured senator in the history of the Commonwealth of Virginia. So a very powerful political family from Winchester. And some of you might recognize the individual right there. That is Dr. Douglas Southall Freeman, one of the foremost Civil War historians of all time. Now, when Churchill arrived in Richmond, he was going to use Richmond as kind of the base of operations, because really if you're touring battlefields in Virginia, Richmond's not a bad place to kind of have your base of operations from. You can go south to Petersburg, you can go around Richmond, you can go up to Manassas, you can go over to Fredericksburg. So a good location. And of course, Churchill, it was once said, had very simple tastes. He liked the finest of everything. So he kind of weasels his way into staying at the governor's mansion in Virginia. Winston's going to make quite the impression during this time. Now, Churchill was noted for being habitually late. No matter what, he was going to run late. And on his first night there, the Byrds have prepared a very fine dinner party for Winston. Harry Byrd's son, Harry Jr., as well as a cousin, were waiting for Churchill. The cousin, Richard Gray, was wearing a beautiful tuxedo for the occasion. As Churchill comes sauntering down the stairs, he looks over at this gentleman in a tuxedo, kind of looks him up and down, and says, "Butler, get me a newspaper." Well, what do you do? Winston's just asked you for a newspaper. So Byrd's son and Mr. Gray go out and they go find the nearest newsstand where they get a copy of the Richmond News Leader and bring it back to Churchill. Now, for their efforts, Churchill tips them a quarter, which they kept for the rest of their life. During this time, as Churchill is eating the fine Virginia delicacy of Virginia ham, he was asked, how does he like it? And he says, "I would much prefer it with English mustard." Well, as you can imagine, the governor's mansion of Virginia is well stocked, but they probably don't have Virginia mustard. So the First Lady of Virginia says, "Well, would you like some English mustard?" Expecting Churchill will do what anybody does and say, "Oh, I don't want to be an inconvenience, don't want to get in the way." Churchill never felt he was an inconvenience to anybody. His response, "I would much prefer to have the mustard." So now you have to stop the dinner service, go find and procure English mustard in Richmond, bring it back to the service, and then continue. This did not make Mrs. Byrd happy at all. Also, keep in mind, when Churchill's visiting Virginia, it's in the midst of Prohibition. Virginia is known for those really horrendous monstrosities known as dry counties. So getting booze is a little tough, but Churchill found a way to basically smuggle booze into the governor's mansion in Virginia. When he is not having people go get newspapers for him, getting English mustard, or sneaking in booze, he was noted for wandering around the mansion in nothing but a towel.
That's an improvement over the White House.
Well, he does this throughout his life. This is a common theme with Churchill. Henry Byrd Jr., in a really wonderful speech he gives in 1991 to the International Churchill Society, will talk about the feelings of his mother 6 decades earlier. He wrote, "My mother would have been happy had her visitor received an emergency recall to Parliament. I was standing beside her when we all waved Mr. Churchill goodbye. I remember her words to my father as the car pulled out of the driveway. 'Harry, don't you ever invite that man back again.'" Now, when Churchill was not testing every nerve of the First Lady of the Commonwealth of Virginia, he used this time to study the great battlefields of the state. His guide around the battlefields of the 7 days in and around Richmond was none other than Douglas Southall Freeman. Now, during this period, Freeman is finishing up work on what will become his Pulitzer Prize-winning 4-volume biography of Robert E. Lee, which in my opinion is still the finest biography of Lee done to this day. Maybe we don't agree with the interpretations, but there's not been an overall biography, in my opinion, more detailed or better. So Freeman during this time was a noted civic leader, newspaper editor, but he was also kind of the one-man welcoming party for any major visitor to Richmond. So as Freeman and Churchill set out going over the battlefields of the 7 days from June and July of 1862, they had quite a number of conversations. Later, we are going to see, after Freeman's R.E. Lee biography is published, the New York Times, once again a nice connection back to the family of Churchill, noted that, in their words, declared that Lee is complete for all time. As I mentioned, Freeman will win the Pulitzer Prize for his efforts. But if you go to volume 4 of R.E. Lee and you go to the acknowledgments, you'll see a list of individuals that Freeman thanks. One of those is the Right Honorable Winston Churchill, who went over the ground of the 7 days with the writer and made many helpful observations on the terrain. Freeman personally sent Churchill copies of his book, and he will write that, "I hope the books reached you, and if you have the opportunity to glance through them, I hope you may recall the day when some of your Richmond admirers had the privilege of carrying you over the battlefields around the city." Churchill, in his response to Freeman, will write, "I remember that delightful tour of the Richmond battlefields in your company and our memorable dinner that evening." In many ways, both Churchill and Freeman seem to be influenced and inspired by the other, that we'll see in a few moments. This October visit to the battlefields of Virginia became the basis of an article that Churchill published on December 20th, 1929, entitled "The Old Battlefields of Virginia." And really, as you read this article, you really get a sense of the command of the English language that Winston Churchill truly had. He was not only a gifted orator, but he was a tremendously talented writer. He will note that as they began to approach the battlefields, he wrote, "We have exchanged the 20th century for the 19th and crossed the mysterious boundary which separates the present from the past. In his words, we have entered the domain of history." People just don't write like that anymore, folks. That's really good writing. He's going to write, we march with Lee and Jackson, with Stuart, Longstreet, and Early through autumn woodlands, lonely in their leafy splendors of old gold and fading crimson, yet it is a broken land. Winston recalled that from noon till night, with guides excelling in every detail of military history, they moved in a semicircle around Richmond following these 7 days. Churchill wrote, "The farmhouses and churches still show the scars of shot and shell. The woods are full of trenches and rifle pits, and the larger trees are full of bullets." We can merely just go down many of the streets here in Gettysburg and still see what Churchill was speaking to in Virginia. From Richmond, Churchill will travel north to Fredericksburg, where he noted that the trench lines trailing away through deserted forests revive the past with a strange potency. Now, with some hyperbole, he is going to declare the battlefields in that area, thinking of Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, and Spotsylvania. He will write that of that area on which perhaps more soldiers have perished in equal space than anywhere, excepting around Ypres and Verdun. Probably not that level, but I think it speaks to the heavy carnage that we'll see in 4 years of war. The impact of these visits to the battlefield on Churchill was clear, and I think what he says, Churchill sums up what I believe as a battlefield guide to my corps. And what Churchill will say is, in his words, "No one can understand what happened in the Civil War merely through reading books and studying maps. You must see the ground. You must cover the distances in person. You must measure the rivers and see what the swamps are really like." I would argue, if you take anything away from what I say today, boots on the ground is always the best way to learn any battlefield, and certainly Churchill was learning this. Now, despite his serious Civil War study, in 1930 he is going to write an essay that really the best way to describe it is a counterfactual history. So as you're wrapping your mind around that one, it was entitled, If Lee Had Not Won the Battle of Gettysburg. So think about what's being said here. It's not what if Lee wins Gettysburg, it's what if Lee had not won Gettysburg. So the long story short, Churchill really puts together this very bizarre history which makes Harry Turtledove's novels look logical. If you've read Guns of the South, you know what I'm talking about. But what you will see is that Churchill puts together this bizarre what if. And what happens is that on July 3rd, Jeb Stuart's cavalry shows up behind the Union lines on July 3rd, that really terrible interpretation that irks me to no end even to this day. By doing so, Lee's troops are able to seize Little Round Top. The Army of the Potomac is routed. Lee captures Washington, D.C., and in later of 1863, there is the Treaty of Harper's Ferry, where Abraham Lincoln surrenders to the Confederacy. Now, what will happen at this point is immediately the Confederacy abolishes slavery in the South. That's where things go off the rails, folks. And what we will later see is in a roundabout way, because of the Confederacy winning the war, they later form a union with England, what becomes almost this confederation of the United States, the Confederate States of America, and the States of England. Can we see some modern 20th century parallels to that?
Yeah.
NATO. Churchill always had an eye to the future.
70 years ahead of himself.
What we will see is that he also ends up, Kaiser Wilhelm becomes the great man of Europe and lives to a very long life, ensuring peace and prosperity for Europe. So Churchill, though, as he divulges from what-if history, and as I always say, I don't do what-if history, but I just did, I guess. He will later have a number of views during this period from the Civil War. Here is, I always say as a battlefield guide, I read the books so you don't have to. So these are really in kind of the nutshell Churchill's views of the Civil War. He is going to write that it is the noblest and least avoidable of all the great mass conflicts. He feels that slavery is the main cause, but there are other contributing factors. It is a very Virginia-centric view of the war, and in Churchill's mind, Gettysburg is the most decisive battle. Now, while he does cover things that happen in the Western Theater, he pretty much covers the Eastern Theater, more specifically battlefields that he actually visited. He was a great admirer of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. He will write that Lee was one of the most noblest Americans who ever lived and one of the greatest captains in the annals of history. Certainly, we are seeing the influence of Douglas Southall Freeman on Winston Churchill. Now, despite the admiration for Virginia and Lee, Churchill will be very hostile to the institution of slavery. And in fact, he will write, of all the wars men have fought, none was more noble than the American Civil War, but all the heroism of the South could not redeem their cause from the stain of slavery. Now, not to the same level as his Confederate heroes, but he does acknowledge that Grant and Sherman were very capable generals, but maybe not to the same level as Lee and Jackson. He has a very positive view of Abraham Lincoln, but Lincoln doesn't really play a key role in Churchill's kind of narrative of the war, but he does note Lincoln's keen resolve, which I think is a critical part of Lincoln's success. He will also note that Reconstruction was a shameful and discredited episode. And we look at this and we say, a lot of this is really outdated. But folks, this is the standard interpretation of the Civil War in the 1920s, 30s, even up until the 1960s. So this is nothing really kind of out of the realm of what you would see kind of passing as standard interpretations of the Civil War. Fast forward now to New York City. December 1931, I want you to look at this very busy street network that we see. You can see how busy the streets are. Now, Winston Churchill was born and raised in England. They drive on the other side of the road there, folks. So when you're crossing the street, you do not cross a street in London the way you do in New York City, and vice versa. I learned that I almost got hit by a car myself in London once. Fortunately, I did not. Now, in 1931, the financial strains on Churchill are only growing more and more. In the aftermath of the stock market crash of 1929, it is estimated that Churchill lost personally in today's money around $1.3 million. So just like in 29, I need money. What do? Another lecture series. So away he goes. But on December 13th, 1931, history was almost profoundly altered. As Churchill is crossing Fifth Avenue, he looks in the wrong direction. No sooner as he steps out into the street, he'll be struck by a vehicle moving anywhere between 30 to 35 miles an hour.
Should have killed him.
It should have killed him.
Yeah.
Absolutely, it should have killed him. Imagine Churchill dies in 1931. There is a scary what if for you. And if that happens, I can say this, we would be having profoundly different conversations about the Second World War than what we're having today. He survives, but he's severely injured. You'll actually see a photo of Churchill in his wheelchair. You'll see he has a large gash on his head, his shoulders, his hips, everything is in rough shape. Now, as he's being treated, keep in mind, this is Prohibition. Churchill will get a doctor's note. The doctor's note will prescribe at a minimum the equivalent of 8 ounces of alcoholic spirits a day. Now, to put that in perspective, that's about the same equivalent of like a hip flask. That's the minimum he needs a day to recuperate. So we will see him here. Now, it's during this time that Phyllis Moore will become his personal secretary. Now, Moore writes a wonderful memoir of her service, which really she was with Churchill really for 1932. And she publishes this in 1941. So this is a really great insight into Churchill in this era. And she's going to write that I hit upon Mr. Churchill on what it must have been one of the lowest ebbs of his life. The accident had left him in a state of complete physical exhaustion. A deep, livid gash on his forehead gave him the air of a sorely wounded warrior, and the droop of his powerful shoulders betrayed a weariness which the jauntiness of his attire could not disguise. During this time, Churchill's depression over his political prospects, his financial prospects are building. So what does he do as he's depressed? He heads down to Nassau for 3 weeks to recuperate. He'll return in January of 1932 and actually, despite his physical shape, will continue most of his lectures during this. Keep in mind, he needs the money. In February of 1932, with his future very much in doubt, Churchill makes his way to Washington, D.C. So what was Churchill like in February of 1932? What was his personality like? And once again, we go back to Phyllis Moore and her memoir, because this is a really great insight into him. She described Churchill as having the face of a good-humored bulldog, and that he usually presented an oddly crumpled appearance. Mr. Churchill's appearance is inclined to be sloppy, but not for want of valeting. His suits are cleaned and pressed every day, and his shoes are carefully shined. It is simply that he has a knack for looking crumpled. She notes that Churchill never really walks. He always seems to canter. He is always in a hurry, but for some mysterious reason can never get to an appointment on time. Whatever Mr. Churchill is working at, he is always in a desperate hurry. The slightest delay irritates him beyond measure. Pot calling the kettle black. Mr. Churchill, whose mind is at its keenest when his body is perfectly comfortable and relaxed, works best in bed, a fat cigar clamped between his teeth, surrounded by the latest newspapers, a pile of books, and his famous blue dispatch box. She later noted, even when Mr. Churchill was in the bathtub, there is no respite for this secretary. She noted that his power of concentration was another source of continual wonderment to me, adding later, his memory is encyclopedic and manifests itself in odd ways. Now, when Churchill travels to Washington, he will stay at the British Embassy. He is the guest of Sir Ronald Lindsay, the British ambassador to the United States. Lindsay was described as a towering, majestic figure of a man, the tallest diplomat in the service. Picture your just quintessential British gentleman. That is Sir Ronald Lindsay. Moore noticed the awkwardness between these two. At times, Churchill requested the ambassador to consult on the day's activity in Churchill's bedroom. You're asking the ambassador to come see you in bed, not the other way around. And this would typically take place when Churchill was eating breakfast in bed. she would write, "These two made the oddest contrast, the immensely dignified diplomat standing extremely ill at ease at the foot of an old-fashioned four-poster, and the Peter Pan of British politics sitting up in bed, a cigar in his mouth, his tufts of red hair as yet uncombed, scanning the morning newspapers." Now, Lindsay has a very interesting connection to the Civil War. Lindsay's going to be married twice, both times to Americans. In 1909, he marries Martha Cameron, the granddaughter of Simon Cameron, at one time Lincoln's Secretary of War. After his wife's first death in April, his first wife's death, not her first death, you can only have one. But see, you learn something new every day. After his first wife's death in April of 1918, he married Elizabeth Sherman Hoyt in 1924. Both of his wives were grandnieces of William Tecumseh Sherman. I guess everybody's got a type. So it will be this contrast of these two individuals who will set out for Gettysburg on February 17th, 1932. When Churchill visits Gettysburg, when he decides to do this is a little bit unclear. We don't really know when Churchill said, "I'm going to Gettysburg." According to a War Department memo dated February 18th, 1932, written by Colonel E.E. Davis, superintendent of the Gettysburg National Military Park, he was following instructions for the visit per a phone conversation on February 15th and 16th. Churchill's here on the 17th, so this seems to be a very quickly thrown together visit. The Gettysburg Times article published on February 16th reported that Colonel Davis informed the Gettysburg Chamber of Commerce that Lindsay and Churchill would be visiting the next day. The article noted that plans for the reception and entertainment were completed at a well-attended meeting of the Gettysburg Chamber of Commerce in the Gettysburg Hotel Annex Monday evening. Per the instructions given to Colonel Davis, he was told to meet the British delegation in Emmitsburg, Maryland. From Emmitsburg, they would then move towards Pennsylvania with a police escort. Davis wrote, "The party arrived at Emmitsburg around 12:30 p.m. and we proceeded immediately to the park office in Gettysburg." This is what the park office was in 1932. Does anybody recognize that building? It's our library today. It was originally built as a federal building. The Park Service had its offices there for a while. So Churchill, whenever you go to check out a book, imagine Winston just walking right up those stairs right there. The Gettysburg Times is going to report that, in their words, the party slipped into Gettysburg almost unnoticed and endeavoring to avoid any public demonstration. The party arrived at around 12:50 that afternoon. So they leave Emmitsburg at 12:30. They're rolling into Gettysburg 20 minutes later. Police escorts allow you to do that. Now, what's very interesting is that obviously the locals were planning some kind of reception for Churchill. But there's some evidence that really the plan was that Churchill would not be interacting with the public. With a personality like Winston Churchill, he makes a lot of enemies. There are a number of people that would love to have killed Churchill. In fact, Churchill arrives here with a bodyguard assigned to him by Scotland Yard. And we will see that I think a lot of that is more the security reasons more than anything else. So when they arrive in Gettysburg, the visitors were shown the relief map, which is today International Park Visitor Center. That relief map was designed by Emmer Cope, who Jim talked about earlier. Maybe one of the most influential figures in shaping what the Gettysburg battlefield looks like today. The park bridges, the park towers, the roads, all designed by Emmer Cope. In many ways, the battlefield is his. What John Batchelder does for the history of Gettysburg, Emmer Cope does to really the physical appearance of Gettysburg. So after seeing the relief map and getting a brief talk, they will have a luncheon that the British delegation provided for themselves. Kind of an interesting take. They bring their food with them. Wonder why they did that, with maybe security threats? There you go. So very soon after, they begin to tour the battlefield. Now, unfortunately, I do not have a photograph of Churchill's guide, William Allison. But I want to point out this photo taken from what was then called the Ziegler's Grove Tower, looking out over to the fields. This is taken in the early 1900s, but the battlefield really did not change that tremendously much. Notice Webb Avenue right there, Meade Avenue right here, roads that you no longer see on the battlefield. It kind of gives you a sense of what the battlefield looked like. Now, it was noted that immediately after lunch, in Davis's words, we started on a tour of the battlefield, which was very thoroughly conducted considering the time available. Davis continued, I furnished for the occasion Mr. William Allison, guide, who had overseas service as a lieutenant, is a careful student of the battle, and was able to tell an unusually intelligent story and answer unexpected questions, many of which were asked to him by Mr. Churchill. The Gettysburg Times reported that shortly after 2:45, Mr. Churchill and Sir Lindsay began their tour, and it was noted in Colonel Davis's automobile, appropriately decorated with American and British flags, led the way for this tour of the field. Now I'll tell you one thing I can say with certainty, the superintendent of this park is never going to let me use his car to do a tour. So will never let us use his car to do a tour. So, because we're just merely guides. But, oh, sorry. So now, as they're going through, he noted that they all seem to enjoy their tour. Now, Allison did a fairly standard tour. We know that he stops at McPherson's Woods. We know he goes to Little Round Top, and we know he goes to the Angle. Folks, when you're doing a 2-hour battlefield tour, those are usually your 3 kind of stops you're going to make even today. Now, it was noted that each of the distinguished gentlemen enjoyed themselves very much the trip. But Phyllis Moore noted that at Gettysburg, Churchill startled the guide by correcting him as to the disposition of troops and guns. There's nothing I love more on a tour. Now, but then again, this kind of doesn't jive with some of the other accounts. The Gettysburg Times is going to report that all along the tour, the 2 distinguished visitors voiced their appreciation of the guide's recital. For both Mr. Churchill and Sir Lindsay, the tour of the battlefield was their first, and both expressed that they might return again soon. Davis noted that unfortunately the day was foggy and threatening rain all the time, so the visibility was poor. The visitors were told that if they could make it convenient to return at a time when the weather was better, they would be more than welcome to come back. This suggests that I think Churchill at least was wanting to come back to Gettysburg to maybe get a little bit more time, very comparable to what he did in Virginia in 1929, but it really appears his schedule did not permit that. The party departed Washington around 4 o'clock. So think about this for a moment. They begin the tour shortly at 2:45. They're leaving at 4 o'clock. That's moving, folks, on a tour. And that's really moving. So who was the guide that gave Winston Churchill the tour? Well, it is none other than William Allison. William Allison is the author of a short story, The Battle of Gettysburg. He is also one of the original licensed battlefield guides in 1915. So Allison was part of that first group of guides. He scored 5th on his exam. I only finished 9th on mine. But he will continue to guide until November 4th, 1917, when he enlisted in the United States Army for service in the First World War. He will serve as a 2nd lieutenant assigned to the 112th Infantry in the 28th Division. Allison served with distinction during the war and was discharged in May of 1919, where he returned to civilian life in Adams County. After the war, Allison and his wife settled in Arnottsville, where he continued to work as a guide. Eventually, Allison will be appointed as the superintendent of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg in 1944, a position he held until his death on July 11th, 1945. When Allison died, he noted that his funeral, the Gettysburg Times noted that Allison's funeral was largely attended and that he was buried with military honors, which included a firing squad and taps being sounded over the grave. At the time of his death, 2 of Allison's children were serving in the United States Marine Corps. His son was decorated for his service in the Pacific. His daughter, though, was serving at what was then known as Henderson Field at a place called Cherry Point, North Carolina. I grew up literally 5 miles from the main flight line there. Today, Allison is buried in the Soldiers' National Cemetery, where he served as superintendent near the graves of Union soldiers, which he spent a career telling their stories too. So a very, I think, important figure in all of this. Now, during their visit, and probably one of the reasons why the tour was cut short, is that both Churchill and Lindsay requested what was described as a strong desire to see the cyclorama. Now, at this point, the cyclorama is located on Baltimore Street, more or less where the Gettysburg Tourist Center is today. Here it is. This is the building that Churchill would have gone to. Of course, later will be removed to what was the old Cyclorama Center on Cemetery Ridge, that by building tore down the Ziegler's Grove Tower that we once had here. So it all kind of goes full circle. Now, just one problem when they're visiting in February. In the middle of the week in February in Gettysburg, how much stuff is open?
Not much.
Not much, folks. It was the same thing in 1932. So they found out it was closed. Colonel Davis, kind of scrambling, sends one of his assistants to locate the manager of the Cyclorama, which he was able to do, and the building was open for the accommodation of the party. Davis reported that Mr. Cobean, the manager, explained the cyclorama very plainly and answered a great many questions which the visitors asked. It was noted that both expressed pleasure with the painting of Pickett's charge. After their tour, after the cyclorama, they will make their way back to Washington, D.C., to the British Embassy. Fast forward to 1943. What a difference 11 years makes, folks. Between May 12th and May 25th of 1943, the Third Washington Conference was held. It was codenamed Trident. Prime Minister Winston Churchill is meeting with his ally, United States President Franklin Roosevelt, to discuss the Allied strategy in the war against the Axis powers. The photo we have here is actually Churchill crossing the Atlantic in the Queen Mary with his staff. The photo that you see here is Winston Churchill and FDR fishing at FDR's retreat known as Shangri-La, later Camp David. So if you ever wanted to see Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt fishing, there you go. Now, this was a very important meeting. I mean, the things that they were discussing were just minor topics, such as the invasion of Sicily, the extent of the military force that would be used, the date of the invasion of Europe, and the progress of the Pacific War were all discussed during this time. Churchill and Roosevelt met every 2 days in the White House, and the British and American military leaders met almost daily in the Board of Governors room at the Federal Reserve Building. Now, real quick, does anybody know what connection the Federal Reserve Building has to the Gettysburg Battlefield? The Federal Reserve Building is designed by an architect, a Frenchman by the name of Paul Cret. The Eternal Peace Light Memorial in Oak Hill, designed by Paul Cret. So, believe me, I can connect this battle to anything, folks. Which is basically the whole topic of this talk today. So, while they were meeting, the decision was between FDR and Churchill, let's blow off some steam. Let's go on a road trip. So, let's hop in a car. Let's get my wife, Eleanor. And oh yeah, let's get my trusted aide, Harry Hopkins. And we're going to take a little trip up to Shangri-La from Washington. So, they're driving up what's today Route 15. So as they are passing either near or through Frederick, the accounts differ, talk begins to go to the Civil War. And of course, one of the great stories in Frederick, Maryland is the story of Barbara Fritchie, who supposedly told Stonewall Jackson, don't fire. Later, there's a famous poem written. Well, at this point, FDR starts to recite the poem. He gets about halfway into it, begins to lose his steam, and then he kind of forgets the rest of it. And that's when Churchill kicks right in and finishes the whole thing. Now, as they are making their way to really close to Thurmont, Maryland today, Churchill will see a sign for Gettysburg. And he asks, how far is Gettysburg from here? I think what he's doing is saying, can we go to Gettysburg? When they're told it's a little too far out of the way, Churchill, I think, is a little bit sullen. But he then, for the rest of the drive, begins to recite in excruciating detail all the movements of the Confederate Army into Pennsylvania in the summer of 1863. It was said outside of the driver and Churchill, everyone else was asleep. So even in this tense time, the Civil War is not far from Churchill's mind. Less than a month after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Churchill is going to address a joint session of the United States Congress. I love, at this point, he makes the distinction. He says that if the roles had been reversed, that my mother was English and my father was American, he said, I might have made it here on my own, which I always thought was a great quote. But what he writes, though, in the speech, he writes of, I think, in many ways, his personal view of the war. He writes, I have been in full harmony all my life with the tides which have flowed on both sides of the Atlantic, against privilege and monopoly, and I have steered confidently towards the Gettysburg ideal of government, of the people, by the people, for the people. Speaking again to Congress, this time on May 19th, 1943, Churchill's task was to continue to reinforce a common cause, unified strategy, and a mutual resolve, which he will invoke once again the American Civil War. Churchill will write, "I do not intend to be responsible for any suggestion that the war is won or will be soon over," invoking, of course, the American audience. He will note, "No one after Gettysburg doubted which way the balance of war would incline, yet far more blood was to be shed after the Union victory at Gettysburg than in all of the fighting that went before." He's going to continue, "By singleness of purpose, by steadfastness of conduct, by tenacity and endurance, such as which we have far displayed, by these and only these can we discharge our duty to the future of the world and to the destiny of man." Churchill, of course, will later draw parallels between the Civil War and the Second World War. He will write, "There was about General Lee a quality of selflessness which raised him to the highest rank of man, and in General Marshall and in General Eisenhower that character, that quality of selflessness, has been a bond that unites the Allied armies and a key to victory." Now, he doesn't get to go to Gettysburg in 1943, but he does get to visit Gettysburg in 1959. At this point, Churchill is 85 years old. He has already suffered numerous strokes. In fact, in 1953, he begins planning his own funeral. This will be Churchill's last visit to Gettysburg, and it's very fitting that he meets President Eisenhower here. You'll see Eisenhower and Churchill going around in an electric golf cart. You'll see the larger one driven by the Secret Service. Of course, look what it's named. I don't know how she would feel about, name the golf cart after her. I don't know. Maybe something a little bit better, but who knows? So what we will see is that when Churchill's here, he will visit on May 6, 1959. During Churchill's visit, Eisenhower took his old friend over his farm, and they actually toured the battlefield in a very unique way. Marine One, which they actually flew over the fields of Pickett's charge. Part of that is that Churchill probably was not in any physical condition to actually do any long, extended tour out, so the helicopter was maybe the best way to do that. Together, these old allies reaffirmed their personal friendship as well as the special relationship the two nations held. Both Churchill and Eisenhower were both avid painters, and in honor of the visit, Churchill gifted Eisenhower one of his paintings, which Ike proudly displayed in the White House, in the Oval Office. We now move to London, January 30th, 1965. 6 days before, Winston Churchill has passed away. And it's interesting with Churchill, he had so many brushes of death that if anybody could beat death, it's Winston Churchill. But between 1953 and 1965, Churchill will suffer 8 strokes. The 8th is what finally kills him. The state funeral was planned out just 6 days later, and it was actually meticulously planned out by Churchill beginning in 1953, and really by 1958, the plan was put together. The plan was actually known officially as Operation Hope Not. And of course, Churchill would be very involved in the planning. It was estimated that over 100 world leaders converged at St. Paul's Cathedral in London to bid farewell to Winston. Leading the American delegation was none other than President Dwight Eisenhower. Now, former President Eisenhower. Churchill requested that at his funeral be played the Battle Hymn of the Republic, a song really synonymous with the American Civil War. Churchill's justification for this was a way to honor his mother's American birth. But I think it was also a recognition of those soldiers who had played such a large role in shaping who Winston Churchill was through his study of the American Civil War. Certainly a nod to his childhood interest. So with that, that is the brief account of Winston Churchill's visit here to Gettysburg in 1932.